I should say up front that I did not request the posting. I want that on the record before anything else. The board has the transfer order in front of it, requisition 7 Sankathara, dated the 14th of second month, signed by Deputy Administrator Seth Morvan. What the transfer order does not say, because transfer orders never say the honest thing, is that I had just spent 11 months disagreeing with Morvan in writing about the annex's logistics staging protocols. 11 months of formal objections, each one filed correctly, each one answered with a shorter and shorter reply. The last reply was 4 words, noted, see attached. The attached document was my transfer to the sketh-voral integration unit, Kethara Annex, effective in 10 days. So I want the board to understand that when I walked through the annex gate on the 3rd of third month, I was not there because anyone thought I was the right man for the job. I was there because Morvan needed me somewhere I couldn't file objections about staging protocols, and the sketh-voral unit had burned through its last 3 supervisory placements in 8 months. 2 resignations and 1 medical transfer. The position was, in the administrative vocabulary of this station, a dead assignment. You filled it with someone you were done with. I was someone Morvan was done with. The math was not complicated. The transit from main station was 4 hours by standard hauler. I spent the first 2 hours reading the integration file on the sketh-voral unit, which was substantial. 47 pages of behavioral logs, 16 pages of incident reports, and a 3-page addendum titled Supervisory Position History. That was, in its way, the most useful part of the whole document. The first supervisor had lasted 6 weeks before filing a stress-related medical withdrawal. The second had lasted 2.5 months before submitting a formal position release citing irreconcilable integration environment. The third had lasted 11 weeks and left no written explanation at all, which I found more informative than the others. People who file formal explanations are usually still processing what happened to them. People who leave without explanation have been through something they don't have the vocabulary for yet. I read the behavioral incident logs carefully. They described a pack that had been, over the course of 8 months without stable supervisory placement, progressively claiming more of the integration annex's physical space. Not aggressively, exactly. The logs didn't describe charges or attacks. They described a pack that had begun treating the barracks wing as an extension of the courtyard, sleeping in the corridor, blocking passage through the double doors, marking territory along the barracks wall. It was a pack that had been in an unstable environment for too long, and had responded by making the environment more definitively theirs. I spent the second 2 hours of the transit thinking about this, and about what it meant that no one had apparently asked why the pack was doing it. The incident reports cataloged behavior. None of them asked about cause. The gate guard at the annex entrance was a young woman named Specialist Veth Orani, and she looked at my transit papers with an expression I recognized. It was the expression of someone who has been told to expect a problem, and is now watching the problem walk through the door in a civilian-grade logistics coat and worn field boots. She stamped my papers anyway, which I respected. The integration supervisor will meet you at the barracks wing junction, she said. The unit is currently in the courtyard for morning exercise. The sketh-voral, I said. Yes, sir. How many? 7 active, she said. 4 adults, 3 juveniles. The juveniles are, she stopped, reconsidered. The juveniles are active. I had read the file on the transit over. Active was a careful word. The file used words like territorial assertion, unsanctioned enclosure modification, and escalating boundary behavior in the section covering the last 6 months. The section covering the 3 previous supervisory placements used the words unworkable integration environment, which was the administrative vocabulary for. The pack decided these humans were not theirs, and made that determination clearly enough that the humans eventually agreed. The integration supervisor was a logistics sergeant named Duven Preth, 26 years old, who had been in the role for 3 weeks, and had the precise look of a man who had not slept well since taking it. He was waiting at the barracks wing junction exactly as Veth Orani had promised, holding a data panel and a mug of something that had gone cold. "Major San," he said. "Just San," I said. "I'm not current rank. The posting is civilian supervisory." "Right." He looked at my file on the panel, then at me, then at the panel again. I was 59 years old, which I could see him calculating against the assignment. "The morning exercise period ends in about 40 minutes. I can brief you on the unit before the courtyard transition." "Where's the courtyard?" He pointed down the barracks corridor, which ran east-west, long and straight, with unit housing doors on either side and a set of double doors at the far end. The doors had reinforced frames and a latch bar that looked newer than everything around it. "Through there," he said. I started walking toward them. "Major San," he fell into step behind me, data panel still in hand. "The integration protocol recommends that new supervisory personnel observe the unit through the monitoring array before direct contact. The protocol specifies a minimum of—" "What protocol number?" Brief pause, 7B. "More vents." Another pause, shorter, "Yes." "I've read Protocol 7B, I said. "It specifies a minimum of 5 observation sessions before unsupervised contact. It does not specify anything about supervised contact on day 1, which is what this is. You're here." He was quiet for a moment. "I am here," he agreed, with the tone of a man who was not entirely happy about it. I lifted the latch bar on the double doors and pushed them open. The courtyard was walled on 3 sides, old station stone, 2 meters high, with a 4th side that was the barracks building's exterior wall. The morning light came in at a low angle, cold and flat, and the sketh-voral were arranged across the courtyard in a loose cluster near the far wall. All 7 of them. The adults were larger than I'd expected. The file had measurements, but files described dimensions. Standing in the actual courtyard, watching 4 animals the size of large warhorses turn their heads toward me simultaneously, I understood the previous supervisor's hesitation in a way I hadn't on paper. The sketh-voral are wolf-shaped in the way that a summary is shaped like the thing it summarizes. The architecture is familiar: 4 limbs, a long spine, a wedge-shaped head with deep orbital ridges, but the scale is wrong for the instinct. Their manes start at the skull and run down to the shoulder blades, thick and pale at the edges where it shifts to darker banding, and they carry them half-raised when alert, which all 4 adults were doing now. The juveniles were smaller, cat-sized approximately or closer to a large dog. They were pressed against the legs of the biggest adult, the pack female I'd later learn the annex staff called Gray, though she was not gray. She was the color of ash mixed with charcoal, with amber eyes that caught the morning light and held it. The juveniles were watching me with the same amber-eyed intensity as the adults, which is its own category of experience when it is directed at you by 3 animals that are working out what you are. I stood in the doorway. Duva and Preth stood behind me, not in the doorway, which I noticed without comment. The pack did not move. The adults held their position near the far wall. Gray's mane was fully raised. The male beside her, Slate as I'd come to call him, though he had no name at that point, had his head at a slight angle, which the file told me was an auditory targeting posture. He was listening to something I couldn't hear. I stayed where I was. I had no protocol for this moment, and I had no plan. What I had was 31 years of logistics experience, which had taught me, above most other things, that in an unknown environment the first thing you do is wait for information. So I waited. The courtyard was quiet except for the wind off the station's outer hull, which came through a ventilation gap high in the west wall and moved the juvenile nearest to me, a small one, darker than the others, with a torn left ear just slightly. Not fear, more like wind moving grass. After approximately 2 minutes, which I know because I checked my timepiece. The torn-eared juvenile detached itself from Gray's legs and walked 3/4 of the way across the courtyard toward me. Then it sat down. It looked at me. I looked at it. Duven Preth behind me said nothing, which was the right call. The juvenile dust, eventually, because of the color, sat there for roughly 30 seconds. Then it made a sound I can only describe as a low, questioning exhalation, pitched upward at the end and looked back at Slate. Slate had lowered his mane slightly. He was still watching me. I sat down on the courtyard floor. I want the board to note that I did this because my knees were aching from the transit, and there was no furniture, not because I had read anything in Protocol 7B about floor-level presentation being a calming signal. I simply did not want to stand anymore. Dust walked the remaining distance and sniffed my left hand. I let it. Duven Preth made a sound behind me that I believe was involuntary. Dust finished its assessment of my hand and sat down again, this time approximately 30 centimeters from my left knee. It resumed looking at Slate. Slate was still watching me. Gray's mane came down 1/4 of the way. The two remaining juveniles, Sill and Rake, lighter colored, with the paired shoulder markings that would later cause 3 different annex staff members to ask me if they were from the same litter, which they were pressing forward against Gray's legs in a way that suggested intent rather than restraint. "You should probably not move quickly," Duven Preth said from behind the doorframe. "I'm 59 years old," I said. "I don't move quickly on principle." The board has already read the formal integration logs from 3rd month through 6th month, so I will not rehearse every incident. What I will do is give the board the shape of it, because the shape is what matters. By the end of the first week, Dust was following me down the barracks corridor during the morning transition from courtyard to unit housing. Not every morning, most mornings. By the end of the second week, Sill and Rake were doing it too. They would wait near the courtyard doors on their side, not mine, and when I lifted the latch bar in the morning, they would fall in behind me and walk the corridor at roughly knee height, which is not knee height for a normal adult but was approximately chest height for 3 sketh-voral juveniles. Duven Preth found this alarming for the first week. By the second week he had stopped mentioning it, which was his version of adaptation. What Duven had not stopped doing was watching. I came to understand this about him over those early weeks. He was a careful observer who had not yet found anyone worth reporting his observations to. He had 3 weeks of notes in his monitoring logs that no previous supervisor had thought to read. I started reading them at the end of my first week. They were detailed, precise, and full of questions that the previous supervisors had apparently not found interesting. One entry, dated the 2nd day of Duven's posting, said, "Pack female oriented toward barracks corridor for approximately 40 minutes this morning, beginning at 6:30. No stimulus identifiable from monitoring position. Resumed normal courtyard activity at 7:10. Notable: this is the 3rd consecutive morning this behavior has occurred. Possible acoustic or olfactory trigger from main station transit arrivals. Recommend further observation." The transit arrived every morning at 6:30. I sat with that entry for a while. Then I went back and read the entries from the previous 3 weeks, looking for the same pattern. It was there, faintly, a morning orientation in the courtyard that the previous monitors had logged as pack restlessness without tracing its direction. They had been watching for aggression. Duven had been watching for pattern. The difference in outcome was not small. "You saw they were waiting for something," I said to him, the morning after I read those entries. He looked up from his data panel with the focused expression of someone who has been asked the question they've been turning over in their own head. "I thought they were waiting for something. I didn't know what." "They were waiting for the supervisor to be someone they could use," I said. He thought about this for a moment. Someone they could trust. "Same thing," I said, "from their end." The adults were a different and slower matter. Gray and Slate and the two other adults, Frost and Wind, a bonded pair who slept pressed together against the east courtyard wall every night, watched me for the first 3 weeks with the patience of something that has decided to withhold judgment temporarily. I did not push. I came to the courtyard each morning at the same time. I walked the same route through the barracks corridor. I sat in the same place near the courtyard's south wall when the weather permitted, and at the doorway when it didn't, and I read my logistics paperwork because I still had logistics paperwork regardless of what Morven had thought the transfer would accomplish. The pack watched me do this. I watched the pack. We maintained this arrangement without drama until the 4th week, when Slate walked across the courtyard and lay down 6 meters away from me, which was, as Duven told me later, with some emotion, the first time any of the adults had reduced distance with a supervisory placement without being prompted by feeding protocol. I said morning because I didn't know what else to say. Slate looked at me for a long moment. Then he put his head down on his forepaws. That was the 4th week. By the 6th week, Gray had begun walking the barracks corridor behind me in the morning, which meant the full juvenile cohort in front of me and Gray behind me, with Slate and Frost and Wind still in the courtyard, but oriented toward the sound of my footsteps through the wall. I know they were oriented toward me because Duven, who had by then installed himself as a permanent fixture in the monitoring station, confirmed the acoustic tracking posture every morning, and told me about it every evening with the enthusiasm of a man who has found a problem more interesting than the one he thought he had. "They're tracking your route," he said one evening, over station-grade meal packets. "Specifically your route. I walked the corridor this morning at the same time in your coat. You left it on the hook near the monitoring station, and Gray didn't come out. You walked the corridor in my coat. Protocol 7B doesn't have a section on olfactory variants," he said, slightly defensively. "I was running an experiment. And Gray didn't come out. The juveniles came to the door, sniffed the coat, and went back to the courtyard. Then they waited at the courtyard side of the doors for another 40 minutes. I thought about this. They knew it wasn't me. They knew the coat wasn't you," he said. "There's a distinction there that I think is important." He was right. It was important. I thought about it for the rest of that evening, sitting in the supervisory quarters that were only slightly better than the unit housing, and decided that Duven Preth was considerably more useful than his initial presentation had suggested, and that his 3 weeks of apparent exhausted survival prior to my arrival had in fact been 3 weeks of careful observation that he simply hadn't known what to do with until he had a supervisor worth reporting to. I filed that assessment in the integration log and sent a copy to the annex administrator, Supervisor Heth, who was not Morven's placement and who read everything I sent with what I came to understand was genuine attention. In 4th month, Heth came to observe the unit in person. She was not required to. The annex administrator's responsibilities were administrative, and the integration unit was technically a separately budgeted program. She came because she had been reading my logs and Duven's monitoring notes and had decided she wanted to see the thing rather than just read about it. She stood in the courtyard doorway for about 10 minutes, watching. Gray watched her back. The juveniles were at my knee. I was seated near the south wall with the morning paperwork. Slate was lying across the courtyard in his usual position, head on forepaws, amber eyes open and tracking. "How long did it take," Heth said finally, "for the adults to accept you in the space?" "Slate moved closer around week 4, I said. Gray started the corridor walks around week 6. Frost and Wind were slower. They came to the doorway together around week 9, but they still prefer the east wall." She was quiet, looking at Frost and Wind, who were looking back at her. They were not threatening. They were simply assessing. "The previous supervisors," she said. "None of them made it past week 6, I said. "Which was when Gray started the corridor walks. I don't think that's coincidence. They left right when it started working." I think they left because it started working, I said. The corridor was manageable when it was an empty hallway. Gray in the corridor changed the nature of the space. The previous supervisors had been treating the pack as a containment problem. When the pack started treating the corridor as shared territory, that was, I thought about how to phrase it, a different kind of problem. A relationship problem, Heth said. Logistics problem, I said. Same tools, different application. She smiled at that briefly. Frost took 2 steps in her direction. She held very still. Frost studied her for approximately 30 seconds, then turned and went back to the east wall. They're deciding about me, she said. They decide about everyone who comes through. And if they decide wrong? They haven't yet, I said. From what I've seen, they're better at it than the intake file suggests. Heth stood in the doorway for another few minutes, then left. Before she went, she told me that she'd asked Morven's office 3 times to authorize a formal xenobiology assessment of the unit and been denied 3 times. I told her I thought a formal assessment would change the integration strategy considerably, and that I'd be glad to include documentation supporting the request in my next monthly log. She said she'd appreciate that. I filed the documentation. It did not change Morven's position, but it was in the file when it mattered later, which was the point. The matter of the courtyard wall came up at the end of 4th month. I should explain what had been happening to the courtyard wall, because the board's documentation describes it as unsanctioned structural modification, and while that is technically accurate, it lacks context. The sketh-voral mark territory through a combined process that involves the scent glands at the base of their manes and the secondary claws set on their forepaws, not the primary claws, which are the large rear-angled ones built for grip and leverage, but a shorter inner set that produce a finer scoring pattern. The scoring is not random. Duvan and I spent 2 weeks in 4th month mapping it. The pattern concentrates at specific structural points, corners, joints, the bases of load-bearing elements. It is, so far as the xenobiology lead at the annex, a contractor named Sova Prael, who had been waiting 6 months for someone to give her access to the unit, could determine an encoding of root and ownership. Sova had been assigned to the annex xenobiology program 9 months before my arrival, with a mandate to study the sketh-voral integration. She had been denied access to the unit by each of the 3 previous supervisors, for reasons that the access request logs described as pending behavioral stabilization. What this meant in practice was that no one had ever asked the pack a systematic question in a language they understood, which meant no one had ever received a systematic answer. I authorized her access in my 3rd week. The board has the authorization in the integration file. She came in on the 4th week, cautiously, with a light probe and a data recorder and the expression of someone who has been kept out of a room they've been hired to study. She sat against the south wall beside me and did not approach the pack, did not make noise, did not do anything except observe and record. The pack observed her in return. By the end of the 2nd session, Dust had come over to investigate her equipment case, which she documented with the contained excitement of a professional who has been waiting a very long time for exactly this. By the end of the 4th week, she had begun to map the courtyard wall notation. "They're writing something," she told me one afternoon, crouched near the west wall's base where the scoring was densest. She had a light probe and a data recorder and the expression of someone who has been given an early birthday present. "The notation is here, here, and here." She pointed to 3 junction points in the wall's stonework. "These are the anchors. The marking between them fills in the claim." "What does it say?" She looked up at me. "I've only had 4 weeks, but the pattern is expanding. It started at the southwest corner in early 3rd month and it's been extending east and north since then." A pause. "Since roughly your arrival, to be specific." "Coincidence?" "I am a xenobiologist," she said pleasantly, "so I don't work in coincidences." I looked at the wall. The scoring was deep in places, not damage exactly, but permanent. The kind of mark that would require active removal, not just time. "They're writing my name," I said. "I believe they're writing something that means this place is the ward's," she said. "Ward is approximately my translation of the designation. It implies custodian, anchor point, the thing that makes the territory coherent, the thing that stays." I stood there for a moment looking at the west wall of the courtyard, which had my name carved into it in a language I couldn't read. Gray was on the far side of the courtyard watching me look at the wall. Slate was beside her, head slightly tilted, listening. The three juveniles were arranged behind them in the loose triangle that I'd begun to recognize as their resting formation, Dust in front, Sill and Rake flanking. "How permanent is the notation?" I asked. Sova Prael looked at the scoring, then at her data recorder. "Structurally, the claw set produces a keratinous resin compound in the scoring groove as part of the marking process. It bonds with the stone." She paused. "I would need to lab confirm the exact bond strength, but preliminary assessment is that it's significantly harder than the surrounding material. You would essentially need to replace the wall. Or the section of wall." She looked at it again. "Several sections now." I nodded. I didn't say anything else. I made a note in my integration log that evening. Sketh-voral territorial notation confirmed extending through courtyard perimeter. Structural elements involved. Recommend xenobiology assessment be formalized and included in any disposition planning. I sent a copy to Supervisor Heth. Heth sent back, "Understood, notation on file, thank you, Son." Morven had read access to the integration logs. I know that because the response from his office came 8 days later. The communication from Deputy Administrator Morven's office was addressed to Supervisor Heth and copied to me, which told me everything about how it was intended to land. It was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph referenced the annex integration, unit's operational costs for the quarter, and expressed concern about resource allocation efficiency. The second paragraph referenced the 3 previous supervisory placements and described the unit's integration progress as below threshold for continued program viability. The third paragraph directed Heth to initiate the formal disposition review process for the sketh-voral unit, with an estimated timeline of 60 days to final determination. Disposition review. That was the administrative vocabulary for begin the process of ending the program, which included, in its final stages, culling the unit. I read the communication twice, then I walked to the courtyard. Gray met me at the doors, not at her usual distance. She was at the threshold when I lifted the latch bar, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her breath on the cold morning air, and she looked at me with those amber eyes that didn't ask anything and didn't give anything away, and simply noted that I was there. "Morning," I said. She turned and walked back toward the west wall, which had my name carved into it in a language I couldn't read but was beginning to understand. I followed her. I will try to describe to the board what happened over the following 40 days without editorializing, because I understand that editorializing is not the purpose of this deposition. I will present facts. Fact 1. I filed a formal response to Morven's communication within 48 hours. The response documented the integration progress of the sketh-voral unit in quantitative terms, the reduction in unsanctioned boundary behavior, down 80% from the previous supervisory period, the xenobiology assessment progress. Sova Prael's report was now 40 pages and growing. The behavioral documentation, Duven's monitoring records, which were meticulous, and the unit's demonstrated capacity for stable social bonding with assigned human personnel. I categorized this as evidence of integration viability and requested that the disposition review timeline be extended to allow for formal assessment completion. Fact 2. Morven's office responded in 11 days. The response acknowledged receipt of my filing and reiterated the 60-day disposition timeline without modification. Fact 3. I filed again. This time I included Sova Preel's preliminary xenobiology findings on the territorial notation, with her structural analysis of the wall-scoring compound. I flagged, specifically, the engineering implication, that the sketh-voral's territorial markings had produced a material change to the courtyard's structural elements that would require formal engineering assessment before any relocation or disposition activity could proceed. I was not inventing a problem. It was a real problem. I was simply nodding it formally, which no one had done before because no one had looked at the wall closely enough to understand what the pack had done to it. Supervisor Heth read that filing within the hour. She called me on the station's internal comm that evening. "The engineering implication," she said without preamble. "Yes," I said. "You're saying the pack has structurally modified the courtyard. Sova's assessment says the bonding compound is harder than the surrounding stone. I'm not an engineer. I don't know what the formal classification of that is. It seems like something an engineer should determine." A pause on the line. Heth was a careful woman. She'd been running the annex for 6 years, and you don't run anything for 6 years on a station like this without learning to read the shape of a problem before it becomes a crisis. "I'll request an engineering assessment," she said. "That seems prudent," I said. Fact 4. 3 annex engineers assessed the courtyard over a 2-day period in the 41st through 42nd days of the disposition review timeline. The sketh-voral were present throughout the assessment. Gray and Slate positioned themselves at the south wall during the first day of the assessment, not threatening the engineers, not approaching them, simply present. By the second day, Sill and Rake had settled against the east wall near the engineers' equipment cases and gone to sleep. The lead engineer, a methodical woman named Coordinator Thess, told me afterward that this had made the second day significantly easier to complete. "They just went asleep next to the gear," she said, with the tone of someone reporting a professional anomaly. "They do that," I said. "They've been doing it with the monitoring station equipment for about a month." Thess looked at me for a moment. "How long have you been here?" "4 months. She looked at her data panel, then at the courtyard doors. "That is a remarkably fast turnaround for a sketh-voral unit with this record." "I just walk through the door every morning at the same time," I said. She seemed to find this inadequate as an explanation, but she didn't press it. The engineering assessment was filed on the 43rd day. Its conclusion, in formal terms, was that the sketh-voral territorial notation compound had bonded with the courtyard stone elements at a molecular level, and that the affected sections, which by then included the full lower meter of 3 walls and the base courses of the 4th, could not be removed without compromising the courtyard's structural integrity. Relocation of the pack without prior structural remediation would create a hazard classification issue for the courtyard space. Structural remediation would require partial demolition of the annex's east barracks wing, estimated at 4 to 6 months, and a budget figure that I will let the board find in the engineering report rather than quote here. The engineering report landed on Morven's desk on the 44th day. His disposition review response came back on the 46th day. It was 2 sentences. Disposition review timeline extended pending structural remediation assessment. Unit integration program to continue under current supervisory placement. Current supervisory placement, that was me. I want to be honest about what I felt when I read those 2 sentences, because the board has asked me to be candid, and I intend to be. I felt tired, not relieved, not triumphant. Tired in the way you feel tired when a thing you were not sure would hold has held, and you realize that holding it had been costing you something you were spending without noticing. 31 years of garrison logistics teaches you to hold positions. It doesn't teach you which positions are worth holding until you're in the middle of one. I walked to the courtyard. Dust was at the doors before I reached them. I had stopped lifting the latch bar myself. The juveniles had worked out the mechanism somewhere around the 6th week, and they handled it now from their side. Dust pushed the door open with its shoulder and sat down in the gap, looking up at me. I sat down on the floor of the barracks corridor, because my knees were doing what they always did by late afternoon. Dust climbed onto my right knee. It was approximately the size of a medium dog by then, and had not yet worked out that this was no longer as comfortable for either of us as it had been in third month, and put its chin on my shoulder. From inside the courtyard I could hear Slate moving. A moment later he appeared in the doorway, stepping over Dust without ceremony, and settled on the corridor floor beside me with his head against the wall. Gray was behind him. Frost and Wind came last, pressing in from either side until the corridor was, technically speaking, full of sketh-voral. Sill and Rake had found my left arm. I sat in the barracks corridor with 7 sketh-voral arranged around me and read the 2 sentences from Morven's office again on my data panel. The panel's screen light was warm. The corridor was quiet. After a while, I put the panel down. Duven found me there 20 minutes later. He stood at the far end of the corridor, data panel in hand, and looked at the arrangement for a long moment. "The disposition review is suspended," I said. "I saw the filing," he said. He didn't move closer, the corridor being what it was, but he stood there for a moment longer with an expression I'd come to recognize. It was the expression he got when something confirmed a pattern he'd been observing long enough to start doubting. "They knew before you did," he said eventually. "What?" "The pack. Gray started the corridor walk this morning before the filing came through, 40 minutes before. He looked at his panel, then at the pack, then back at me. I logged it." I thought about this. The sketh-voral were not, so far as anyone knew, able to access administrative networks. But they had acoustic sensitivity the monitoring equipment could only approximate, and the annex's internal comm lines ran through the walls of the barracks wing, and Duven's office, where the filing notifications went, was at the near end of the corridor. "She heard my comm notification," I said. "The filing alert has a distinct chime," Duven said. "I've had the same alert setting for 3 weeks." I looked at Gray, who was lying across the corridor with her head on my knee and her amber eyes open, and tracking the middle distance. "You heard it first," I said to her. She said nothing. She was a wolf-shaped apex predator the size of a warhorse, and she had no opinion about my need to narrate events she had already processed and acted on 20 minutes ago. There was an incident in 7th month that I should mention, not because the board has asked about it specifically, but because it is relevant to the question of the pack's integration scope, and because the incident report that exists in the administrative record describes it in terms I find insufficient. The incident report describes it as unsupervised sketh-voral juvenile access to Annex Administrative Corridor, 7th month 14th, approximately 11:30 hours. Duration of access, 40 minutes. No personnel injuries. No structural damage beyond pre-existing territorial notation. Unit returned to integration courtyard under supervisory guidance. What the incident report does not describe is how it happened, which I will now do. In 7th month, I was called to the Annex Administrative Office for a quarterly review meeting with Administrator Kale. This was routine. I had attended 3 such meetings before, each lasting approximately 1 hour, each held in the administrative corridor's east-facing conference room, which was on the opposite side of the annex from the integration courtyard. I had attended each of those previous meetings without incident and returned to the courtyard afterward to find the pack exactly as I'd left them. The sketh-voral had demonstrated, consistently, that they understood my absence as temporary. I came back. This was the relevant fact. On the 14th, the quarterly review ran long. Kale had received preliminary word from Morven's office about the structural remediation assessment timeline. This was the assessment that would eventually come back as operationally prohibitive, and he wanted to discuss the contingency planning implications. The meeting ran to approximately 2 hours and 15 minutes. At approximately 11:30 hours, the administrative corridor door opened and dust came in. Not through the exterior access, which is a keyed door. Through the internal corridor that connects the administrative wing to the barracks wing, which has a standard pressure latch handle, which Dust had apparently determined was the same class of mechanism as the Courtyard double-door latch bar, and which it had spent approximately 40 minutes working out while I was in the meeting. Dust walked down the administrative corridor, located the conference room by, I assume, acoustic tracking, pushed the door open and came in. Cale and I and 2 administrative assistants looked at Dust. Dust looked at me, then at the room, then at me again. It made the low, questioning exhalation. I had been in this meeting for 2 hours and 15 minutes. From Dust's perspective, I had been absent for 2 hours and 15 minutes, which was significantly longer than the previous meeting absences. "I'm sorry about this," I said to Cale. Cale looked at Dust for a long moment. Dust had, at this point, been growing for 7 months under reasonably good nutritional conditions, and was no longer the cat-sized juvenile that had sniffed my hand in the courtyard. It was approximately the size of a large sheepdog, and its mane was coming in, and its amber eyes in the conference room light were very clear and very steady. It came through the internal corridor, one of the administrative assistants said, with the tone of someone documenting an event for a report they were already composing. "It's worked out the handle mechanism," I said. Cale looked at the door, which Dust had let swing closed behind it. Then he looked at Dust, who was now sitting beside my chair with its shoulder against my leg in the manner it had adopted when it wanted to communicate that it had been waiting a reasonable amount of time. "We should probably finish the meeting," I said. We finished the meeting. Dust sat beside my chair for the remaining 20 minutes, which the administrative assistants logged in separate notes with slightly different levels of detail, both of which are in the administrative record. The conference room door had been propped open for the remainder. Cale had been the one to prop it, on the grounds that if the other 2 were coming, he wanted to see them coming, which was a reasonable position. The other 2 did not come. Sill and Rake, as Duven's monitoring log confirmed, had reached the internal corridor entrance, assessed it, and returned to the courtyard when they heard Dust's questioning exhalation through the wall, which they had apparently interpreted as a positive status update. They were waiting at the courtyard doors when I came back. I had the handle mechanism on the internal corridor door replaced with a keyed lock the following morning. This is in the maintenance log. Dust assessed the new lock, determined it was a different class of mechanism, and returned to the courtyard without apparent frustration. It has not attempted the internal corridor since. I do not know whether this means the lock solved the problem, or whether Dust determined that it had established sufficient information about the administrative corridor to satisfy its purposes. I have my suspicions, but I have not yet asked Sova to formally classify them. The board has asked me to address the incident of 3rd month of the following year, which is the event logged as unsanctioned perimeter assertion. Station Gate 7. I would prefer to address it in context, so I will briefly describe the preceding circumstances. The structural remediation assessment, which Morvan had ordered as a condition of the extended disposition review, was completed at the end of 1st month of the following year. Its conclusion was substantially the same as the original engineering assessment, only longer. The cost estimate had increased by roughly a third due to updated materials pricing and a revised assessment of the East Barracks Wing's interconnected load-bearing elements. The revised figure was, in the words of the Annex's senior administrator, not Heth, who had been promoted to Regional Logistics Command in 10th month, but her replacement, Administrator Denver Cale, operationally prohibitive. Cale presented this finding to Morvan's office in 2nd month of the new year. Morvan's office responded with a revised directive. Rather than remediation and relocation, The unit was to be assessed for in situ long-term integration under a permanent supervisory assignment. Permanent supervisory assignment, that was me. I read the directive in the integration supervisor's office, the same office I'd taken over from Duven Preth when he was promoted in 10th month, a development I had been glad to see. And then I walked to the courtyard and told Gray about it, which is not a thing I put in the integration logs because the integration logs were read by Morven's office, and some things are not their business. I sat against the west wall, which had my name in it in a language I had spent a year learning to read. The designation ran from the southwest corner to the northeast arch, the full perimeter by now, Sova's most recent mapping showed, and in the section she had fully translated, it said something like, "This place holds what is ours, the Wardanker, the one who walks the same path every morning and does not leave." Gray was beside me. Slate was lying across my legs, which was no longer comfortable in the way it had been when he was younger, but Slate had made this arrangement in 4th month and saw no reason to revisit it. Dust, Sill, and Rake were somewhere behind me, which I could tell by the weight distribution on my shoulder and the sound of juvenile breathing. Frost and Wend were at the east wall, their preferred location, watching the courtyard in the patient way they watched everything. I leaned my head back against the stone with my name in it and looked at the morning sky. "We're staying," I said. Gray turned her head and looked at me. Then she looked back at the courtyard, which was hers, which had always been hers, which she had simply been waiting for the right anchor to confirm. That is the context for the Station Gate 7 incident. What happened at Station Gate 7 is as follows. In 3rd month, Morven visited the annex. I believe this was the first time he had visited the annex in person since before my posting, which is a logistical choice I understand. Sketh-voral Annex is 4 hours by transit from the main station administrative center, and Morven was a man who managed at distance. He came, as I later learned, because the Permanent Supervisory Assignment Directive had created a budget line item in the annex's operational account that required his signature, and he preferred to see what he was signing for before he signed. He arrived at Gate 7, which is the annex's public access entrance, at approximately the 9th hour. I know this because Veth Orani, who was still on gate duty, she'd been at Gate 7 for 3 years by then, and showed no signs of leaving, sent me a message the moment she saw his transit credentials. I was in the courtyard. The sketh-voral were in the courtyard with me. We had a morning routine by then that had become efficient. Gray and I walked the perimeter first. She had adopted my habit of a full circuit before settling, and I had adopted her habit of checking the notation points at each corner, which in my case meant checking them with my hand rather than my scent glands, but the pack seemed to find this adequate. Then Slate and Frost and Wend settled in their positions. Then the juveniles, who were no longer small, Dust was now past my knee at the shoulder, Sill and Rake slightly smaller but growing fast, arranged themselves in the loose triangle formation near the south wall that they'd maintained since cubhood. I was reading. I heard Gate 7 before I saw Morven because the sketh-voral heard it first. Slate's head came up, then Gray's. The juveniles lifted out of their resting positions in a single fluid motion, not startled, not aggressive, simply alert and oriented toward the barracks corridor doors. I put down my reading. Morven came through the annex with Kale and 2 administrative aides, and they came through the barracks corridor because that is the direct route from Gate 7 to the integration supervisor's office, which is where Morven intended to begin his visit. He did not send notice ahead of the corridor transit. Kale had tried to brief him on the unit's morning schedule, which I know because Kale told me this later, with the expression of a man who had done his due diligence and was nodding it for the record. I was at the courtyard doors when they came through. I had opened them from my side. Morven stopped when he saw me, then he saw what was behind me. The board should understand that from Morven's position in the corridor at that hour of the morning, what he would have seen was the following. A 59-year-old civilian logistics supervisor in a worn field coat, standing in a doorway. Behind the supervisor in the courtyard, 4 adult sketh-voral. In the doorway itself, or in the corridor immediately adjacent to it, 3 sketh-voral juveniles who were no longer quite juvenile, pressed forward in formation and watching Morven with amber eyes that had, in the past year, developed an expression I can only describe as assessment. Morven was a man who moved through administrative environments with confidence. He had been doing it for 20-plus years, and it showed. He knew how to read a room. He knew how to enter a situation that was not going his way and redirect it through sheer velocity of intent. He did not move. I think it was Dust that stopped him. Dust had stepped forward to the corridor floor, not past the threshold exactly, but forward, and sat down. In the way Dust had sat down in the courtyard on the 3rd of third month, the year before, approximately 3 meters from a logistics supervisor who had just walked through a set of doors and sat on the floor. Dust was studying Morven with the same comprehensive amber attention it had given me that morning. Sill and Rake had positioned themselves on either side of Dust. They were not blocking the corridor. They were simply in it, in the triangle formation they had maintained since cubhood, grown now to the size where the formation occupied rather more corridor than it once had. I let the silence run. "Son," Morven said eventually. "Deputy Administrator," I said. He looked at Dust. He looked at the pack behind me. He looked at Kale, who had the expression of a man who had done his due diligence. He looked at his 2 administrative aides, who were both standing very still. "The integration progress is," he started again. "The behavioral assessment in the last reports indicated stable." "It is stable," I said. Dust made the low questioning exhalation I knew, the one pitched upward at the end, the one that had once been directed at Slate and was now increasingly directed at me. This time it was not directed at either of us. It was directed at Morven. Morven did not move. "They're assessing you," I said. "It's not threatening. They do it to everyone who comes through the corridor." "Everyone?" "Everyone new," I said. "They know the regular staff." Behind me, I heard Slate stand up. Then the sound of his stride across the courtyard, a deliberate, unhurried movement that produced a particular resonance in the stone that the pack used as a signaling mechanism. Duven had documented it in his monitoring logs for months. It meant, approximately, the ward is at the threshold. Slate appeared behind me. He was taller than I was, as tall as I was when standing, significantly taller than I was sitting, and I was not sitting, and he lowered his head to my shoulder level and looked at Morven. I will say for the record that Morven did not step backward. He held his position. I give him that. But he also did not move forward. And he did not say what he had apparently intended to say when he came through Gate 7 that morning, which Kale later told me had been a preliminary framing of the budget conversation that included some language about reassessing the long-term supervisory model. One of the administrative aides, the younger one, made a small involuntary sound. Sill looked at him. It was not a threatening look. It was the same look all 3 juveniles used on anyone new to the corridor, the look that meant, "We are determining what category you belong to." The aide stood very still and apparently passed the assessment because Sill looked away again. Gray appeared at my shoulder. She had come across the courtyard at some point that I hadn't tracked. She moved quietly for something her size, which was a thing I had stopped being surprised by but had never entirely gotten used to. She stood beside me and looked at Morven and then at the corridor generally, in the way she looked at the full perimeter every morning. Note the corners, note the positions, note the gaps. She was not threatening him. She was simply establishing, without any particular drama, that she had noted him. Morven's eyes went from Slate to Gray and then to the wall behind me, which was visible from his position, the lower meter of the west wall, which was the most densely marked section, the oldest notation, The section Sova's full translation had rendered as, "This is where the Wardanker stands. This is where he returns. This is the first mark and the one from which all others are measured." He looked at it for a moment. "The xenobiology report," he said, not to me specifically. "Sova Prael's full translation is in the integration file," I said. "The preliminary publication is attached to the file as Annex Document 7 Prael. The second paper is pending peer review." He looked at the wall a moment longer. "I'll need a moment to review the integration logs," Morven said, "before we discuss the operational parameters." "Of course," I said. He looked at Slate. Slate looked at him. Gray had come to my other side at some point that I hadn't tracked. I felt her warmth at my left elbow. "The supervisor's office is this way," Cale said gently from several meters back. Morven went to the supervisor's office. I stayed at the courtyard doors for another few minutes while the juveniles settled back into their morning formation. Then I went in, because I had integration logs to review and a budget conversation to prepare for, and I had 31 years of logistics experience to bring to it, which meant I had spent the past 3 days documenting every operational cost efficiency the unit's continued integration had produced for the annex, and cross-referencing it against the structural remediation cost estimate that Morven had decided was prohibitive. The meeting lasted 2 hours. At the end of it, Morven signed the budget line for the permanent supervisory assignment. He also signed a secondary document that formalized the xenobiology assessment program under Sova Prael, which gave her the access and budget she had been working without for nearly a year and a half, and which I had quietly included in the packet because it was the right thing to do, and I was fairly certain Morven would sign anything I put in front of him that morning. He left through Gate 7 at the 11th hour. Veth Orani stamped his exit credentials with the same expression she'd given my arrival credentials 14 months earlier. I watched him go from the barracks corridor junction, with Dust at my knee and Sill leaning on my left leg and Rake attempting, as it had been attempting for 2 months, to work out whether it could put its forepaws on my shoulders without being told not to. I let it. Rake put its forepaws on my shoulders, which was heavier than it sounded but manageable if you planted your feet, and looked in the direction Morven had gone with an expression I could not formally classify but privately describe to myself as satisfied. "Yes," I said, "go on. The board has asked me whether the long-term integration program is, in my assessment, viable. I will say this. The sketh-voral notation that runs the perimeter of the courtyard, which Sova Prael has now fully translated and published in 2 preliminary xenobiology papers. The first time sketh-voral territorial marking has been formally documented in an integration context, describes the courtyard as a Wardanker territory. The translation is necessarily approximate. The concept does not have a precise equivalent in our administrative vocabulary. What it encodes, as best Sova can render it, is, this space holds the one who returns, the one who walks the same path, the one whose route is the boundary of what is safe. The notation has been extending slowly since 3rd month of last year, not into the barracks wing, not through the administrative sections of the annex, along the barracks corridor only, the route I walk every morning from the integration supervisor's office to the courtyard doors and back. The engineers have assessed this 3 times now. Each assessment produces the same conclusion. The compound bonds harder than the stone around it, and the corridor, structurally speaking, is no longer separable from the pack that lives in the courtyard at its end. Dust has taken to sleeping against the corridor wall outside the supervisor's office door. Not inside, the juveniles respected the office threshold from early on, which I had not enforced and had never needed to. Just outside. I have a chair I put in the corridor for the mornings when Sill and Rake join it, because if all 3 of them settle against the wall, they block the door. The chair is in the integration logs. Duvan filed a note about it when he was still monitoring. Sova found it and laughed and asked if it was the most human thing or the most sketh-voral thing, and I said I genuinely didn't know. She put that exchange in her second paper, which I thought was excessive, but she said the documentation was relevant to questions of bidirectional behavioral adaptation, and I did not have the xenobiology training to argue with her. The corridor chair is now, in Sova's formal taxonomy, an element of the Wardanker's fixed-point equipment. The pack knows what it is. Gray checks it when she comes through the doors in the morning. Slate has leaned against it twice, which produce structural effects that I have documented but not yet flagged to engineering, on the grounds that I would prefer to deal with one load-bearing modification at a time. I come through the annex gate at the same time every morning. I walk the same corridor. I lift the latch bar, or, more often now, wait for dust to push the door open from the other side, which it does when it hears my footsteps. I walk the courtyard perimeter with Gray. I sit against the west wall in the good weather, near the southwest corner where the notation is oldest and densest, where my name has been written in a language I learned to read over the course of 14 months of walking through the same door every morning and sitting down on the floor when my knees hurt. The wall says, "This is where the Wardanker is. This is the edge of what is safe." He returns. The board has asked me whether this is viable. I've been returning every morning for going on 2 years. The wall has been there a good deal longer than I have, and will likely be there when I'm done. The pack will be there longer than the wall. The notation will be there longer than the pack, because it's harder than the stone around it, and the engineers have told me 3 times now that you cannot take one without taking the other. Whatever Morven intended when he sent me here, I do not think it was this. I do not think it was 7 sketh-voral who know the sound of my footsteps through 2 walls and a set of double doors. I do not think it was a courtyard with my name in it in a language older than the station. I do not think it was a 59-year-old logistics supervisor sitting against the west wall every morning with a wolf-shaped apex predator across his legs, reading the day's paperwork while the juveniles argue about the corridor chair. I think it was meant to be a dead assignment. I think the pack had other plans. That is my assessment of the program's viability.